The crystal water glass trembled in her fingers, just slightly, just enough to send a single drop cascading over the rim and onto the pristine white tablecloth. And in that moment, before Nathan Cole could even open his mouth to deliver the sharp, dismissive rebuke already forming behind his teeth, a small hand appeared from nowhere. A child's hand, steady, practiced, holding a cloth napkin with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He wore a collared shirt that had been ironed carefully but showed the soft wear of many washings. His dark hair was combed neatly to one side, and his posture, that ramrod-straight spine, that slight forward tilt of attention, was so hauntingly familiar that Nathan felt the blood drain from his face. Because he knew that posture. He saw it every morning in the mirror. The boy didn't look up at Nathan, didn't acknowledge the billionaire sitting frozen in his tailored Armani suit. Instead, the child's eyes went to his mother, the waitress in the pressed black uniform, and in that single glance was a universe of unspoken communication. "I've got this, Mom, I'm here." And standing 3 feet behind him, watching with identical dark eyes and that same impossible posture, was his twin brother. Nathan's throat closed, because now he understood why the waitress's voice had sounded like a ghost, why her hands, those hands he'd once held in a different lifetime, had trembled as she'd approached the table, why she'd apologized not to him, but to the elegant woman sitting across from him. His fiancée, who was now looking at those 2 boys with slowly dawning comprehension. His fiancée, who was doing the math in her head. His fiancée, who was realizing that the man she thought she knew, the self-made billionaire with the carefully curated origin story, had left something out of his narrative. Something big. Something about 8 years old. ×2. A billionaire sits frozen as his ex-wife serves his table, while his twin sons stand watching, their faces mirrors of his own. How did Nathan Cole bury an entire family, and what happens when his fiancée realizes the truth? If you need to know how this confrontation ends, subscribe now and stay with me, because this story is about to get very uncomfortable for everyone at that table. Let me take you back. 30 minutes earlier, the evening had been perfect. Nathan Cole had walked into Lawrence Steakhouse the way he walked into every room, like he owned it, which frankly he could have. At 52, Nathan had built a commercial real estate empire worth north of $2 billion. He'd been featured in Forbes, interviewed on CNBC, invited to speak at conferences where other billionaires took notes. He was, by every measurable metric, a success story. The hostess recognized him immediately. Of course she did. Nathan had been coming to Lawrence for years. It was the kind of establishment where the waitstaff memorized your preferences, where the sommelier knew your wine before you ordered, where discretion was as carefully cultivated as the dry-aged ribeye. Tonight was special, though. Tonight, Nathan had brought Lauren. Lauren Price was 41, elegant in the way that came from old money and careful breeding. She wore a simple black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and a string of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. She moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had never worried about a bill in her life. They'd been together for 14 months, engaged for 3. And in all that time, Nathan had told her everything about himself. Well, almost everything. He told her about the early years, working construction in his 20s, saving every penny, buying his first rundown property at 32. He'd told her about the sacrifices, the 18-hour days, the moment he'd looked at his bank account and realized he'd crossed from millionaire to something much, much bigger. He'd told her about his first marriage too, briefly, carefully. We were young, he'd said, with that dismissive wave of his hand that Lauren had come to recognize as the gesture he used to close a subject. We wanted different things. She wanted the simple life. I wanted to build something. It ended. No drama, no hard feelings. What he hadn't told her was that his first wife's name was Rachel. What he hadn't told her was that he'd left Rachel 10 years ago, when she was 32 and he was 42. What he hadn't told her was that Rachel had been pregnant when he left. And what he certainly, absolutely, had never breathed a word of was that the pregnancy had been twins. Nathan had done what successful men do with inconvenient truths. He'd compartmentalized. He'd moved on. He'd convinced himself that the settlement check he'd written, generous by his accounting, absolved him of any further responsibility. He'd built a new life in a new city, with new people who knew only the Nathan Cole he'd chosen to present. Until tonight, when the past walked up to his table, wearing a pressed black uniform and carrying a tray of water glasses. She hadn't recognized him at first. That was the thing that struck Nathan, the small mercy that had given him a 10-second window to process what was happening before his entire carefully constructed world began to fracture. Rachel had approached from his blind side, her attention focused on balancing the tray correctly. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Fine lines had appeared around her eyes, the kind that came from years of squinting against worry rather than sun. Her hands, he noticed, bore the small calluses of someone who worked with them daily. But her posture, God, her posture. Still straight, still dignified, still carrying herself like she had something to be proud of, even in a servant's uniform in a restaurant she could never afford to eat in. "Good evening," she'd said, her voice the polished neutral of professional service. "Welcome to Lawrence. May I start you off with some water, or would you prefer to see our cocktail menu?" And then she'd looked up. And then her hands had stopped moving. And then Nathan had seen the moment of recognition flash through her eyes, followed immediately by something he couldn't quite name. Not anger, not hurt, something colder, something more controlled. Something like the resignation of a woman who had long ago stopped being surprised by life's cruelties. "Nathan," she'd said. One word, quiet, almost to herself. And before Nathan could formulate a response, before he could decide whether to acknowledge her or pretend he didn't know her or simply stand up and leave, Rachel had done something that stunned him. She'd composed herself. Completely. The recognition vanished from her face like a light switching off. Her professional mask slid back into place. She set the water glasses down with hands that barely trembled and said, in that same polished tone, "I apologize. You reminded me of someone for a moment. Are you ready to order, or do you need a few more minutes?" She was giving him an out. She was offering him the chance to pretend. And Nathan, coward that he was in that moment, terrified of the questions Lauren might ask, desperate to maintain the illusion of the uncomplicated self-made man, had taken it. "We need a few more minutes," he'd said, his voice clipped, cold, dismissive in the way he'd learned to be dismissive with people who served him. He hadn't said her name. He hadn't acknowledged the decade they'd spent together. He'd waved her away with a sharp gesture, the same gesture he used with assistants and valets and anyone else he considered beneath his attention. And Rachel had nodded, murmured, "Of course, sir," and walked away. But not before Nathan had noticed the two boys standing near the service station, watching, their identical dark eyes tracking every moment of the interaction. Lauren had noticed his tension, of course. She was too observant not to. "Everything all right?" she'd asked, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Fine," Nathan had said, "just tired, long week." He'd picked up the menu, started talking about the wine list, tried to steer the conversation toward the upcoming charity gala, the property deal closing next month, anything that would keep Lauren's attention away from the waitress with the familiar face. But his mind was elsewhere. Racing. Calculating. Those boys, those identical serious-faced boys with the dark hair and the straight posture and the watchful eyes. They were 8 years old, maybe 9 at the outside. The math wasn't complicated. Nathan had left Rachel 10 years ago. She'd been pregnant, known that, of course, hard to miss. but she'd been only a few weeks along, and he'd convinced himself it wasn't real yet, wasn't his yet, that the settlement check he'd written included enough zeros to cover whatever situation she decided to handle on her own. He'd never followed up. He'd moved cities, changed his phone number, let his lawyers handle any communication. And he'd never, not once in 10 years, considered that Rachel might have kept the pregnancy. That there might be children. That there might be his asterisk children. The second time Rachel approached the table, she wasn't alone. She carried a tray with their appetizers, the oysters Nathan had ordered without thinking, the burrata Lauren had requested. But walking slightly behind her, trying to be inconspicuous but clearly assigned to shadow her, was one of the twins. The boy carried a small basket of bread. His face was serious. His movements were careful, deliberate, the movements of a child who had learned early that mistakes have consequences. "Your appetizers," Rachel said, her voice steady, professional. She set the plates down with practiced efficiency, and Nathan noticed that her wedding ring finger was bare, but bore the faint tan line of something that had once been there. "The oysters come with a mignonette and a cocktail sauce," she continued, "and the burrata is served with." She stopped, because the bread basket had slipped. Just slightly, just enough for one roll to tumble toward the edge. The boy caught it before it could fall. His reflexes were quick, his save graceful. But in the movement, he jostled the tray his mother still held, and one of the water glasses, just refilled, tipped, and sent a small splash across the white tablecloth. Nathan's jaw tightened. The automatic response was already forming. The sharp word, the cold glare, the subtle power move of making a server feel small for a minor mistake. But before he could speak, the second twin appeared. Silent, sure-footed, already holding a cloth napkin. The boy stepped forward without hesitation, dabbing at the small spill with movements that spoke of practice, of necessity, of a child who had learned to clean up messes, literal and figurative, because that's what you did when your mother worked service jobs and couldn't afford to lose them. He didn't look at Nathan. He looked at his mother. And in that look was something that made Nathan's chest constrict. Protectiveness. An 8-year-old boy silently communicating, "Don't worry, Mom, I've got you. He can't hurt you while I'm here." Rachel touched her son's shoulder briefly, a gesture of thanks, of pride, and then turned to face the table. But she didn't address Nathan. She addressed Lauren. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she said, her voice warm in a way it hadn't been when speaking to Nathan. "Please let me know if you need anything else." And she paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "I want you to know, I teach my boys that service isn't about status. It's about care, taking care of people, no matter who they are or where they're sitting." The words landed like a gentle slap. Nathan felt his face flush. Because Rachel hadn't accused him of anything, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made a scene that would require explanation. She had simply, quietly demonstrated, in front of his fiancée, the difference between having wealth and having character. And she had done it with such grace that there was nothing he could say in response, without looking like exactly the kind of man he was afraid Lauren would discover he was. "Here's my question for you. If you were Lauren, sitting at that table, watching your fiancé treat the mother of his own children like an invisible servant, could you marry him? Would you believe his redemption was real, or would you always wonder who he becomes when no one important is watching? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think." The silence that followed Rachel's departure was thick enough to cut. Lauren set down her fork. She looked at the two boys now retreating toward the service station, walking close to their mother, occasionally glancing back over their shoulders with those watchful, knowing eyes. She looked at Nathan, and she asked the question he'd been dreading. "How old did you say your first marriage was when it ended?" Nathan's throat went dry. "About 10 years ago," he managed. Lauren nodded slowly, "And that waitress, the one who just served us, she seems to know you." I mean, she might have recognized me from. Nathan, Lauren's voice was quiet but firm. Those boys, how old are they? The question hung in the air. Nathan looked down at his untouched oysters. The ice beneath them was beginning to melt, forming small pools of water on the plate. There he stopped, swallowed. They must be around 8. 8, Lauren repeated the word like she was testing its weight. And you left your first wife 10 years ago, when she was, I assume, a young woman who might have been. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Nathan watched as understanding dawned across Lauren's face, not like a lightning strike, but like a slow sunrise, painful in its inevitability, illuminating everything he'd tried to keep in shadow. You knew, Lauren said, it wasn't a question. You knew she was pregnant when you left, didn't you? Nathan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. And in that silence, in that damning, cowardly silence, Lauren Price learned exactly who she had agreed to marry. The rest of the meal was a formality. Rachel returned once more to check on them, professional to the end. She asked if they needed anything. She offered dessert menus. She did her job with the same quiet dignity she'd shown all evening. But this time, when she turned to leave, Lauren spoke. Excuse me, Lauren said, her voice gentle. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Rachel paused. Something flickered in her eyes, surprise perhaps, at being addressed as a person rather than a function. Rachel, she said, Rachel Cole. She still used his name. After everything. After 10 years. After being abandoned with 2 Barbies and no support beyond whatever minimal settlement his lawyers had arranged. She still carried the name of the man who had discarded her like an outdated business asset. Lauren nodded slowly, processing this information. Rachel, those are beautiful boys you have. Rachel's face softened. For the first time all evening, something genuine broke through her professional mask. Thank you, she said. They're my everything. They're the reason I get up every morning. The reason I work double shifts. The reason She stopped herself, glancing at Nathan, then back to Lauren. They're good boys, strong, kind. They take care of me as much as I take care of them. I can see that, Lauren said. The way they protect you, the way they watch out for you, that's not something you can teach. That's who they are. Nathan sat frozen, unable to speak, unable to do anything but watch as his fiancée and his ex-wife had the conversation he should have initiated years ago. Rachel looked at Lauren for a long moment, one woman assessing another. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Rachel said finally, and then, impossibly, she added, and good luck. She gathered her tray and walked away, her sons falling into step beside her. One of them reached up to take her hand. The other walked slightly ahead, scanning the room like a tiny bodyguard. Nathan watched them go. His sons. His asterisk sons. 8 years old, protective, mature beyond their years, clearly loved, clearly raised right. By a woman he'd abandoned. While he built his empire. While he accumulated his billions. While he convinced himself that success meant leaving the past behind. Lauren didn't say anything for a long time. She sipped her water. She studied the tablecloth. She watched the other diners, couples laughing, families celebrating, people living their uncomplicated lives. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost detached. We should go, she said. Lauren, I can explain. Can you? She looked at him directly now, and her eyes held something Nathan had never seen before. Not anger, not even disappointment, something worse. Reassessment. Can you explain why you never mentioned you had children? Can you explain why a woman you were married to for 10 years is working as a waitress, raising your twin sons, while you live in a penthouse and take your new fiancé to expensive restaurants? Can you explain why those boys, your boys, looked at you like you were a stranger? Because you're a complete stranger to your own children. Nathan had no answer. For the first time in decades, Nathan Cole, The man who always had a response, always had a strategy, always knew exactly how to navigate any situation, had nothing. I didn't, he stopped, started again. It was complicated, the divorce, the timing. I was building the company and she wanted. She wanted what? Lauren cut him off. A husband who stayed, a father for her children, basic human decency. The words hit like physical blows. I sent money, Nathan said weakly. The settlement was generous. Generous? Lauren repeated the word like it tasted bitter. Is that what you call it? Generous? Nathan, that woman is working a service job. She's bringing her children to work with her because she probably can't afford childcare. She's wearing shoes that have been resold at least twice. Whatever generous meant to you 10 years ago, it clearly wasn't enough to give her, or your sons, the life they deserved. Nathan looked down at his hands. These hands had signed billion-dollar deals. These hands had shaken the hands of senators and CEOs and celebrities. These hands had built an empire. And these hands had never once held his children. I need to go, Lauren said, standing. She picked up her clutch. She looked at Nathan one more time, and something in her expression softened, not with forgiveness, but with something like pity. I'm going to take a cab home, I think. I think I need some time to think about who you really are, about who I'm agreeing to spend my life with. Lauren, please. Don't, she held up a hand. Don't make promises you haven't earned the right to make. You showed me who you are tonight, Nathan, not with what you did 10 years ago. People make mistakes, people fail, people do terrible things they later regret. But tonight, the way you treated her, the way you dismissed her, the way you couldn't even acknowledge your own sons. She shook her head slowly. That's not a mistake from the past. That's who you are right now, and I need to figure out if that's someone I can build a life with. She walked away. Nathan sat alone at the table, surrounded by cold oysters and melted ice, in the restaurant where his carefully constructed world had just collapsed. He left early, but he came back. Not that night. That night, he went home to his empty penthouse and sat in the dark, replaying every moment, every missed opportunity, every cruel dismissal he'd delivered with a wave of his hand. He came back the next day. Not as a customer, not as a billionaire, just as a man named Nathan, wearing jeans and a plain button-down shirt, standing outside Lawrence Steakhouse at 10 a.m. when the staff arrived for prep. Rachel was among them. The twins weren't with her. School, probably, normal life, the normal life Nathan had never been part of. When she saw him, her step faltered, just for a moment. Then she lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and continued toward the employee entrance. Rachel, please. She stopped, turned, looked at him with those eyes that had once looked at him with love, then with grief. And now with something he couldn't quite identify. What do you want, Nathan? Such a simple question, such an impossible question. He struggled for words, I want to fix this. You can't fix 10 years. I know I can't, but I can. He took a breath. I can start, I can do better, I can be present, I can be responsible. Rachel studied him for a long moment. Behind her, other employees glanced their way with curiosity, then discretion led them inside. They don't know you, she said finally. My boys, they know you exist, I never lied to them about that, but they don't know you, and I won't let you hurt them. I won't let you waltz in with your money and your promises and then disappear again when things get complicated. I'm not asking to waltz in, Nathan said. I'm asking for the chance to earn the right to stand in the doorway. I'm asking for time, not forgiveness. I know I haven't earned that, just time. Silence stretched between them. I've arranged something, Nathan continued. Full support, for the boys, for their education, their future. And for you, I'm paying off your debts, all of them. You shouldn't have to work double shifts. You shouldn't have to bring them to work with you because you can't afford anything else. Rachel's expression hardened. I don't want your money. It's not for you, it's for them. It's what I should have been providing all along. It's not charity, Rachel, it's responsibility. It's a debt I've ignored for 10 years, and I'm finally paying it. She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was softer. "And what about you? What do you get out of this arrangement?" "Nothing," Nathan said. "That's the point. I'm not buying my way back into their lives. I'm just making sure they have what they need, what they should have always had. And if someday they want to know me, if they decide I'm worth knowing, I'll be there. But that's their choice, not mine." Rachel's eyes glistened, just for a moment. Then she blinked, and the composure returned. "You've changed your tune since last night." "I spent last night looking in a mirror I've been avoiding for 10 years. She nodded slowly. "And Lauren, your fiancée?" Nathan paused. "She's taking time to decide if I'm worth staying with. She told me she needs to know who I am when no one's watching." "Smart woman." "She is." Rachel looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the previous night. Whatever she saw seemed to surprise her. "You actually mean it," she said, "don't you?" "I do." "Then prove it, not with checks, not with grand gestures, with time, with consistency, with being there when it's hard and boring and inconvenient. That's what fathers do, Nathan. They show up." "I will." She studied him for one more moment. Then, without another word, she turned and walked into the restaurant. But before the door closed behind her, she paused. "They're in school until 3:15, she said over her shoulder. "Jefferson Elementary, they like to be picked up on time." The door swung shut. Nathan stood on the sidewalk, processing what had just happened. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was something much more precious. It was a chance. 3 weeks later, Nathan stood across the street from Jefferson Elementary School. He didn't approach, didn't make himself known. He just watched as the doors opened and children poured out, laughing, shouting, running toward parents and buses and the freedom of afternoon. And then he saw them. The twins. His sons. They walked out together, side by side, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. One of them said something to the other, and they both laughed, the easy, unself-conscious laugh of children who are loved. Rachel appeared a moment later, coming around the corner from wherever she'd parked. The boys spotted her immediately, and their faces lit up. They ran to her, not because they were scared or needy, but because they wanted to. Because she was their person. She gathered them both in her arms, kissing the tops of their heads, listening as they talked over each other about their days. Nathan watched from the shadows, his eyes stinging. This was what success looked like. Not the buildings with his name on them, not the zeros in his bank account, not the magazine covers or the speaking invitations or the VIP tables at expensive restaurants. A mother and her children together at the end of a school day, the simple, profound miracle of being present. He had missed so much, but he wouldn't miss any more. Lauren didn't call for 2 weeks. When she finally did, her voice was careful, measured, the voice of a woman who had done a lot of thinking. "I've been watching," she said, "from a distance. I talked to Rachel. She told me about the support you've arranged, about the school account, about everything." Nathan held his breath. "I'm not ready to come back," Lauren continued. "Not yet, maybe not ever. What I saw that night, the way you dismissed her, the way you couldn't even look at your own children, that's going to take time to process." "I understand. But I'm also seeing something else, something I didn't expect." She paused. "I'm seeing a man who's actually trying to change, not performing change for an audience, but doing the work when he thinks no one's watching." "I'm trying," Nathan said. "It's all I can do." "Keep trying," Lauren said. "That's all I'm asking. Keep trying and we'll see where we end up." She hung up. Nathan set down the phone and looked out his window at the city below, the buildings he owned, the streets he'd helped develop, the empire he'd constructed one deal at a time. And for the first time in his life, he understood that none of it mattered. Not really. Not compared to a chance to know his sons. not compared to the possibility of becoming someone worthy of the second chance he'd been given. Not compared to the moment, maybe months away, maybe years, when he might finally hear one of those boys call him Dad. He didn't deserve that moment yet, but he was going to earn it. One day at a time. One choice at a time. Starting now. Here's what Nathan Cole learned the hard way. Success isn't measured by what you've built, it's measured by what you refuse to abandon in the building of it. He had billions in the bank and 2 sons who didn't know his face. All the money in the world couldn't buy back those 8 years, but it could fund the next 8, and the 8 after that. True character isn't revealed when the cameras are rolling and the deals are closing. It's revealed in how you treat the people your success left behind. Now, if this story moved you, I've got another one you need to hear. It's about a wedding planner who discovered that the groom she was working with was her estranged father, and he was about to marry the woman he left her mother for 20 years ago. That one's coming next. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell so you don't miss it, because I promise you, the confrontation at that rehearsal dinner is something you won't forget.